Okay, I think we should get going right now. Thank you, everyone, for joining the demo webinar. This is our third in a series of 7, so we have one every week. Next week, we're going to dive into fraud a little bit, but today is how to bring risk and compliance into a unified supplier management process. And we have Akhilesh Agarwal, who's going to walk through apexportal. He leads everything related to apexportal development, deployment. So he's the best person to answer any questions that you have. He's going to walk through risk questionnaires, risk scoring, and also how we can incorporate risk management into onboarding. So Akhilesh, I'm going to hand over to you. And if anyone has a question,
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm Akhilesh Agarwal and glad to join this session today with all of you. I'm going to start sharing my screen and walk through some of the different use cases on risk management and how it can incorporate in your supplier lifecycle. So first, we want to talk about how to set up the risk management system. What are the options available for you to mitigate risk? And go over through that process. Later on, I will show you the supplier's experience on how the supplier gets to answer some of the risk questionnaires, how we create the supplier scores and in terms of risk and so on and so forth. And lastly, we are going to review the risk management dashboard that illustrates the total risk of the supplier with different categories and how you can incorporate it in your workflows on a daily basis. So to start with the session, first, let's log in and talk about setting up the risk management strategy. Because we want it to be integrated in your supplier onboarding lifecycle, the way the Apex portal system works is we have different modules. One of them is registration, something we have talked about in the previous sessions as well. We also have a risk management module that lets us set up the risk attributes for the supplier. Now, when we talk about risk management, every supplier is different and unique, and they often provide different types of product services. They are located in different geographic regions and so on and so forth. So how you manage risk for a supplier in US versus any other international country is fundamentally different. How you manage risk for a supplier who's, let's say, providing flowers in your lobby versus a mission critical supplier who manages your IT systems is also different. So depending on the context, every company has to manage risk differently for their supplier base. So that's why when we start with setting up the risk management process, we first do segmentation of your suppliers, all your existing suppliers, and also new suppliers that may get onboarded on a daily basis. So on the screen, you are seeing the segmentation screen where we have different examples in the demo system of how to segment your suppliers. So you can segment suppliers by saying all my direct suppliers. You can segment suppliers by saying all my IT suppliers. Or you could segment based on the type of questions you want to ask the suppliers. So the segmentation screen allows us to do that. We got multiple segmentation options in the system. So if I hit edit on one of the segmentation, you can see the various options, like we can target specific vendor numbers who are already set up in your ERP system, which can be a list of comma separated values, or we can segment based on different fields, like a claim score, which is an Apex proprietary score on how likely the vendor will have a claim in statement reconciliation process. We can segment based on a DNB score or any other external risk scores that you have a subscription to. Or you could segment suppliers based on the total spend, the type of industry, or the product services they are providing to you. So here are some examples. Or you could segment suppliers based on the country, which I talked about, right? Is the supplier located in a high risk country versus a developed nation like US? Or you can segment suppliers based on diversity code and so on. So these are just a few examples. The system provides no limitation on how you segment suppliers. So it can be any field in your vendor master using which you could do the segmentation. So that's the first step. Once we have done the segmentation, it lists all of the use cases that you have set up. The next step in risk management is the type of assessment you want to do on those suppliers. So the previous example I was showing segmentation based on all direct suppliers. Now, to all my direct suppliers, I want to ask or do a risk assessment based on ethics, right? So does the supplier have policies and procedures in place to make sure they are following ethical policies, they have an ethical workplace and so on and so forth. So we have created an ethics questionnaire, which is a built-in template. I'll be showcasing a lot of different templates during this demo. And based on this template, I want to target a segmentation or suppliers who will see and answer these questions. So that's the setup process here. We can also indicate what comprises of high risk, medium risk, low risk, and so on and so forth, and different thresholds. So every company views risk differently. These are some out-of-box configurations, like if the supplier has a risk score of more than 70 out of 100, so 70 points out of 100, then consider it as a high risk, right? And then we have given criteria for mediums and lows and so on and so forth. So this is one of the ways you can segment and also assign different types of questionnaires. They all get integrated or can be integrated during the registration process. So if you're onboarding a new supplier, you could be targeting these questionnaires, or even post registration on a frequency basis, you can ask these questions from your suppliers, and we'll see some of the examples. So over here, we have some ethics questionnaire configured, IT questionnaires, business continuity plan questionnaires, financial questionnaires, and so on and so forth. So depending on your use cases, there are dozens of templates which are built into the Apex portal system that you can take advantage of out of box, or you can add any number of additional questionnaires and questions to your system. There's no technical limitations to it. Once we have set up the assessment, then we go into the strategy. On the strategy, basically what I talked about earlier was, asking vendors questions or questionnaires at the time of registration. But even post-registration, you can decide a different frequency of your choice. So that's what the strategy is about. So we can send email reminders to the supplier saying, dear supplier, it's been 1 year or it's been 6 months. Please review your the questionnaires and answer questions again. So as an example, right? So you have full control over the execution frequency. It can be executed once, which is really on demand. So you can execute some questionnaires or surveys on demand, or you can set a particular frequency of your choice, like quarterly, annually, and so on and so forth. So once we have set up the segmentation, assessment, and strategy, the system is ready to go in terms of monitoring risk based on questionnaires. There are other types of risk assessments that are built into the system, which are based on external factors, and I'll showcase those as well in this session. So this is how we set it up. I do want to take a moment and show you the supplier's experience. So having set up the risk strategies, if I now log in as a supplier, how do these questionnaires work and what is the supplier's experience? So at this time, I'm going to log in as a supplier and show you what that experience looks like. So once I log in as a supplier, I'm going to get the suppliers dashboard. And in the suppliers dashboard, I can click on update profile to start the risk management process. So on the screen, you'll notice there are a number of pages the supplier can fill out. Right now, you're seeing an example where risk is integrated with the registration or the onboarding process. So whether a new supplier is registering or an existing supplier is updating their profile, the risk questionnaires are integrated and the supplier has to answer them before they can submit their changes. So not to go into every single page, I want to focus today's session on the risk questionnaires. To start with, here's an example of an ethics questionnaire where you have all of the questions configured, and the supplier can be made required to answer all of these questions before they can continue. So in terms of ethics questionnaire, you're seeing an out-of-box configuration. Any number of questions can be added, removed, or changed based on the configuration and the implementation. This is just an out-of-box template. A lot of these questions are based on pick lists. So for example, name the countries where you'll be doing business on behalf of our company. So the supplier can pick one or more countries. Then we have other questions like, to the best of your knowledge, are you a government employee or you're a member of a government organization? Yes, no. Answers, or it can be multiple choice questions and answers as well. In case the supplier enters like a free text value, like in this example, you have please explain. So what will happen is the system can score the risk attributes automatically for a pick list. But if the supplier enters a description, which is free text, then the approver can then decide, based on the answer they typed in, what score to assign to that question. So you have a flexibility in terms of automatic risk scoring and also manual reviews. Based on any of these questions, additional documents can be required. So for example, if I answered the question as, I do have a code of business conduct policy document, I have an anti-corruption policy document, etc. Because I'm answering yes, the system can trigger request for evidence in the document upload page. So you also get a copy of their policy documents. You just don't have to go by the assertion that the supplier is given for the answer. So this is an example of ethics questionnaire. Moving on, we have another example of a different template, which is finance questionnaire. So in terms of financial stability of the supply, you can ask different questions, again, out-of-box configuration. What typically is of interest to you as a client is, what's the annual revenue of the supplier? Has there been any change of ownership structure or mergers and acquisitions, which can trigger additional risk? Do they have a product roadmap in terms of, additional revenue in future, and so on and so forth? One more example I have is of BCP questionnaire. This is very relevant, especially with the pandemic situation and most of us working remotely. So business continuity plan is very important for your suppliers, right? So can the supplier quickly adapt to an environment where they are not able to operate out of their regular offices, right? So we would often check for this type of risk, which has actually been tested in the last 2 years of the pandemic. So very important questionnaire. We have a lot of questions, as you can see, out of box. And based on the supplier's response, we create a risk score for it as well. In fact, we lost additional documentation similar to other questionnaires, where if they say they do have plans and procedures in place, we require them to upload a copy of that document.
Akhilesh, could you highlight a couple of these questions? I know, there's 20 or so there, but, maybe 2 or 3 that are critical.
Sure. So the very first question is, do you have a documented strategy, right? So instead of any ad hoc planning that the supplier may have to do, there needs to be a clear-cut documented policy that, yes, when an event happens, how is the supplier going to continue to operate, right? So that's very important. And if they answer yes, we'll require a document, right? Another important factor is do they exercise and test their plan? Because it's one thing to have policies and procedures in place, but if I've not tested it, how do I know it will actually work when we require it to work, right? So that's another very important question. Most organizations are data driven in this day and age. So another important question here is all the critical data backed up and readily available offsite? So in case of a disaster, can I still get access to my data, and is it in some offsite location, which is not the primary location, right? So the backup has to exist separately than the main data set or the data center. So those are some of the different questions which are really important to capture. Of course, this is a big list to review, but since you asked the question on what are the critical questions, I've highlighted a few.
Yeah, I think the testing of it is a really good question. And maybe this is that question, but it is how often in the past year or 2 years did you need to exercise this type of plan? And maybe even a question for future of what have you added to this plan, or how have you improved this since 2020 or 2021?
Exactly. And to add to that, there are other questions, Matthew, like, are you consulting with some external agencies who are subject matter experts to review your plans, right? And get an updated version of it, right? And are you even certified, for example? So there's a whole certification process, which is relevant to different industries. So are they certified for business continuity, right? So testing is important, and based on those test results, there can be certifications tied to it. So that's one more risk assessment strategy, very important. Another one is IT questionnaire. So this is also significantly important, especially when you are subscribing to SaaS solutions or suppliers providing IT services, whether it's hardware or software services, right? You want to make sure your systems are up and running and they are not down from time to time, and you have those SLAs being complied to. So the IT questionnaire kind of ensures your suppliers are not only adhering to their SLAs, but also in terms of security, data protection, data privacy, they are complying with different use cases, right? So this is a list of questions which are very important in terms of IT. We are asking questions like, do you support single sign-on? And that mitigates a lot of passwords getting compromised. Employees of suppliers leaving the organization, where the supplier may have exposure to SaaS applications that are not configured with single sign-on, and therefore ex-employees could still retain their access, right? So single sign-on is very important in this day and age. Encryption is important, how data is transmitted between two different systems. One of the most pressing industry issue across the board is suppliers' emails getting compromised, right? And when the supplier's email gets compromised, it leads to additional types of risk like fraud risk, where an imposter could impersonate your supplier and leading to a bank account change, leading to a fraudulent payment, and so on and so forth, right? So we are asking relevant questions here, saying how well the supplier is in terms of IT compliance, IT security, how are they managing their data, and most importantly, how they're securing it, right? So a list of these questions will ensure, in identifying what type of risk do you have with different types of suppliers, and then you can make the decisions accordingly or have a corrective action plan for your suppliers. Different clients use these IT questions in different ways. One of the ways is when you're inviting a supplier, like we have a healthcare client who onboards different types of suppliers, and in the invitation process, they ask their internal business users what type of supplier it is, Are they going to access credit card information? If yes, IT questionnaire can be triggered. We can ask whether they are PCI certified or not, and so on and so forth, right? So internal users can go through a survey in the invitation process to identify the types of suppliers who need these type of assessments. So moving on, I'll just quickly preview a couple more templates and then we'll take a look at the risk dashboard. So here's another example of foreign migrant workers, which may be important to different clients based on the type of services you are engaged with. Here's another template of young workers, right? Or child labor policies, in other words, right? So does a supplier have policies, procedures in place to mitigate this issue, which is of great concern to any company out there, right? So do they have documented procedures in place? Are they able to provide evidence? Do they provide overtime to their workers, such as factory workers, and so on and so forth? So here's some examples. There are many more templates built into Apex. I just wanted to present a few of them in the session today. Now let's assume that the suppliers have completed these questionnaires and actually submitted the record. So once the record is submitted, what does the risk dashboard looks like, and how else we can create risk from external data sets? So if I log back in as an admin and I take a look at the risk dashboard, let's see how I can review the information. So as an approver, I'll get this vendor in my approval queue. So you can see this vendor US Foods, it's pending approval. If I click on the vendor controls, I get a whole holistic view of every checks and balance that has been done on this vendor, right? So in our registration module, you get some out-of-box features like address validation, bank account holder validation, bank code validation, and so on and so forth. But in terms of risk scoring, there are additional controls which get populated in the screen. So one of them now you can see is BCP questionnaire because the vendor was presented with that questionnaire. We also have a corruption score index. So based on the country the supplier is operating in, we have a corruption perception index score for every country in the world. And based on that corruption perception index score, we can incorporate it in the overall risk score of the supplier. So in this case, it's indicating 71 out of 100. Then there are many other risk scores that get generated based on every questionnaire the supplier answered. For example, IT questionnaire, migrant workers, there's a news-based scorecard, and so on and so forth, right? Now let's drill down and take a look at how these risk scores were generated. So if I click on any one of the risk scores, I get to this risk dashboard, which presents the overall risk of the supplier. So in this case, this is all made up data. So we are, based on this data set, we are indicating US Foods as a supplier has an overall risk of 66 out of 100, which is not in red, but in yellow, depending on the threshold configuration. So if I look at how the supplier answered the questions, there's an ethics questionnaire, which was answered by the supplier. You can see a lot of questions fall under the category of below expectation, because when the supplier answered the question, they said no to this answer. And the ideal answer should be yes, saying the supply is not owned or managed by any government organization or public official, right? So because they said no to this, it's below your expectation, the total points possible would have been 1, but I got a score of 0 because, you know, it's below my expectation. The same way, depending on the context of the question, a yes or a no answer could mean below or meeting expectation. And then we create the scorecard accordingly. All of this is configurable, which means as a client, you decide the weightage of each question. So how important a question is to you. Right now, the weightage is all 1 for every question, but you can increase or decrease the weightage, which can influence the overall risk score, right? So turning it into red or yellow or green and so on and so forth. So that's an example of ethics questionnaire. Similarly, on the IT side, if I click on it, has a list of all IT questions. Now you can see examples of meeting expectations. So when we ask the question, is all the data encrypted while being transmitted? Is the data encrypted when it's stored in the databases? The answer was yes. That's the ideal answer we are looking for. It meets expectation, right? But they answered no on the single sign-on question. It's below expectation, and so on and so forth, increasing the risk score, right? So depending on the type of question and the answer, we can configure system differently, including points possible in the actual risk score, right? And similarly, all other questionnaires and scorecards get generated based on each category. Now, a supplier does not have to answer all of the questionnaires in one go. Maybe some of these questionnaires are not applicable to a type of supplier, in which case it would be hidden, right? So it's all configurable. Depending on your use cases, we'll implement it accordingly, right? So gives you a preview of the type of risk assessment we can do based on questionnaires. Now let's take a look at a few more examples on how to manage risk based on external data sources.
Akhilesh,
So, go ahead, please.
could I just jump in for 1 second? We had a question, and I don't want to go too far past it. The question was, how long after the questionnaires are submitted is the risk score assigned? And I think a risk score assigned, is it an instant or does it need review?
It's actually instant. That's a great question. So the moment the supplier submits their profile, the risk scores are generated instantly, right? And is available for review. Depending on the steps in the workflow, it may go to different type of approvers, but the risk scores are available immediately, right? Now, in some cases, if the supplier entered a free text answer, right? They typed in the answer versus picking from a list of values. In those cases, it would require some manual review by the approver, and the approver for those questions can manually assign the risk score, right? Because they have to read the answer, interpret it, and then decide what score to give, right? So those are special use cases, but in general, all risk scores are automatic assignment if it is structured data or answered from a pick list.
Great. And any other questions? Keep them coming. Akhilesh, back to you.
Thank you, Matthew. So we all took a look at how these dashboards work based on questionnaires. Now, to jump into a few additional use cases, one of the other things that we do within the risk management system is create scorecards based on external data points. One of the external data points is a news-based scorecard. We integrate with IBM Watson. And using IBM Watson, we are able to search over 300,000 external news sources, even in multiple languages worldwide. And based on the aggregation of that data, we are able to create a score, whether it's a positive news, negative news, or neutral news in nature. And then also assign different attributes to those news, like financial news, operational news, geographic, and so on and so forth, and create this overall risk scorecard. So if we take a look at the supplier's risk score based on external data points, this is not based on what the supplier answered. This is based on our own findings, which is also automatic, right? So over here, you're seeing, well, based on the external news, the significant risk on financials of the supplier, and we are indicating external articles, right, which indicate negative news or neutral news about the supplier. Similarly, if I click on the operational category, there are some additional operational news which are indicating risk. All of these articles that we captured based on external news sources are clickable links, right? So not only we have listed the scorecard and the actual title of the news, but if you're interested to now dig down deeper and see the actual findings, you can click on this link, and now it actually opens the news article about that supplier, and now you can review that to get the right context, right? So this way we are able to assign risk scores based on the news cycles and create this as well. Now, because the supply is not answering any questions to generate the risk scores, we generate it based on a frequency. So we can trigger the news-based scorecard based on new supplier registration. So the first time the supplier registered, or whenever the supplier updates their data, so we can trigger this new scorecard. Or subsequently, we can make it based on frequency, which is every 2 weeks, every month, every year, assess the risk of the supplier, depending on the type of supplier, and then you get this updated scorecard. There's an alerting feature built into the system, which means that you don't have to click on every supplier, review the risk score manually. If everything looks good, let's say there's little to no risk of those supplies, you don't want to spend hours scrubbing through that data set. So what we do is we'll send alerts to the approvers or the risk management team. So only when there is an exception, like the suppliers in that high risk category, they'll get those alerts, they can log into the system and now view what happened with a particular supplier. So that's another example on how we create risk. Now, risk can also be created using external organizations to which you may have subscription to, or it could be your homegrown system or other third-party tools that you use. So two other examples I have in the system is like one is rapid ratings, which is a frequently used tool for creating risk scores. The supplier does not know about this. So again, it's an automatic backend process. DNB ratings, another example, it could be Experian, it could be LexisNexis, it could be any number of systems that you're using. We can connect to it using our standard APIs and pull the data set along with the risk scores, right? So to show you an example of rapid ratings, here's a connection we did with rapid ratings, and for any given supply, you can get this data set which shows the financial risk scorecard about the supply, including some of their data points. And using this, we can create a risk score here. So you can see, whether the supply falls into high risk category, low risk category, depending on, their financials. So just like rapid ratings, we are also able to pull like a DNB rating on any supplier of your where we are assessing risk, and pull that DNB rating and add to the overall risk assessment of that supplier, right? So the goal is to have a 360-degree dashboard for your risk management team where they don't have to log into different systems. It's all in one place. It's readily accessible using these links. And when you're reviewing suppliers, you can get all information in one place, review it, approve it, and it becomes an integral part of the supplier lifecycle.
So Akhilesh, while you were going through that, someone had another question. In addition to negative news searches, does the tool include any access to sanctions lists?
Yes, great question. So on the sanctions list, if I go back to the list of controls, one of the other things that we check upon is something called a prohibited list, right? So this check is built into our system, both in the registration module as well as the risk module. So you get it out of the box. The prohibited list check is scrubbing through 89 plus different lists. OFAC is just one of the 89, right? So we are able to connect to these 89 plus global sanctions list, including OFAC, and do the checks. And if there's a match found, we list it here. So other examples of sanctions list is the FBI watch list, the United Nations watch list, the Bank of England watch list, World Bank, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a variety of data sources that we connect to, and we present it here. For the specific to healthcare industry, I have one more example on that question, which is integration with a third-party tool called Verisys. So Verisys is a sanction list, if you will, for medical workers or healthcare providers, right? So in general, yes, you want to check suppliers against a OFAC list or other sanctions list, but what if it is a doctor or a nurse or a hospital, etc., in the healthcare industry. And you want to make sure that your supplier, which happens to be a doctor, is not on a prohibited list. Maybe they are not allowed to do surgeries anymore, right? So you want to get that additional information on the medical sanction list. So for that reason, we integrated with Verisys. And although it's industry specific, if you're in that industry, you can take advantage of it too. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's one more. I was just trying to hit unmute. Where does the IRS and other validation data come from? And what's your confidence level that those results are accurate, i.e., what's the false positive rate in your validations?
Great question. So one of the fundamental philosophies that we follow in terms of validations is validation directly from the source of the data set. So when we talk about IRS validation as an example, we actually log into irs.gov, we validate the EIN number or the SSN number of the supplier, and only based on what the IRS states, we present the results, right? Including the name match of the vendor. Similarly, if we talk about international tax IDs, we'll connect to the European Union APIs or the Government of India APIs, South Africa, Malaysia, Canada, and the list goes on, right? So it's always to the actual source which issued the data set for validations, and then we use it, right? So it's highly accurate. It's because it's based on the source and not the opinion of Apex, right? So if we call it validation, it's based on the source. If we create a score, then you could say that the score is based on what Apex opinion is, based on our historic data set of 40 million plus golden records. But if you're calling it a validation, it's really from the source and is highly accurate, right? Now, in terms of false positives, it is possible that you may find a vendor in a OFAC list match, right? So OFAC list is an example where, let's say, ABC Corp is found on a OFAC list, but this is a different ABC Corp than the actual vendor which was sanctioned, right? So in terms of prohibited list, it's quite possible that you get a very small percentage of false positives. But with any other validations like tax validation, address validation, and so on and so forth, it's either pass or fail. There's no ambiguity in it.
So I have another question. So I have a couple questions. So let me just read this for a second. I believe there are other abilities such as IP address validation or email address validation. Can you shed some additional light on this information?
Sure. In terms of email validation, we want to ensure that when you are communicating with your suppliers, whether all existing suppliers or you're sending an invite to a brand new supplier, the supply is actually reachable on those emails. So what we do is when the system finds an email address for the supplier, it validates that email, whether it is still functional or not. So we check the domain of the supplier. We check whether the domain has an email server configured and whether that server is reachable. So once we do this check, we'll have a green check on the email validation saying, yes, the email address is still in the works. How that's helpful is from time to time, if the supplier closes business, then as a result of closing the business, they may also end up closing their mail accounts, right? At which time the email validation will start failing, which is an indicator of risk of still making payments to the supplier because their email is no longer functional, right? So that's one way we get some additional insight. Specific to IP address validation, how it mitigates risk is the supplier may generally log in from specific IPs like their office IP address or the work IP address. Now, if suddenly there's a additional login attempt from North Korea, from Iran, from countries where you typically won't expect a supplier to log in because that's not their country of doing business, that's a red flag by itself, and will fail the IP address validation, trigger additional security controls like multi-factor authentication, security questions and answers, and so on and so forth. So without passing those controls, the supplier will not be able to log in the first place. So that's how the IP address validation works. You also have, in terms of IP, like additional controls like pattern detection. So typically, you log in at a certain time interval, but you logged in at 2 a.m. in the morning, which is very odd. We'll flag that as well, right? So the system has a very comprehensive login pattern detection with a list of controls based on IP, the login time, etc., and all of that contribute to securing the data set.
And so another question was, how is banking data validated with banks? And a follow-up, any proprietary information or any proprietary technology within Apex Portal?
A great question. So in terms of bank validation, we have a series of controls built into our system. So for 3 countries in the world, like US, India, Sweden, we validate the bank account through the banking data sources, right? So we are able to check whether the account exists in the bank or not, like the example you're seeing on the screen where the bank account ownership validation is failing because the account number is not good, right? So that's step 1. Step 2 is we'll verify the ownership information and provide it as such. So for these 3 countries, there's official data sources available through the banking networks to which we connect. Now, all banks may not participate, so the match rate may not be 100%. If we do find a match, we'll provide a pass-fail, which is indicating whether you should accept or reject the changes. But if we don't find a match, we'll kind of clearly state match not found. So now it's limited to 3 countries in the world. So in addition to this external validation that we do, Apex has also created a proprietary Bank Pro score, which is global in nature and works for all countries in the world. So how that score works is based on the bank changes made, we'll do the bank account number match with our global 40 million plus supplier database. If we find a match, we are able to verify whether the account number was previously used by that supplier or not, how many payments were made to the supplier in, let's say, the last 1 year, last 5 years, last 10 years, depending on the age of the bank account. So we also incorporate the age. And then how many other clients of that are doing business with that vendor, right? So using a series of information like I described, we are able to create a proprietary score for the bank account, and we are able to indicate how likely the account number belongs to the supplier, and you can use that information to make a decision whether to accept or reject the banking changes, right? So that's the proprietary score that we create. It's not a validation, but more of a score that indicates the likelihood of the account belonging to the supplier. Any other questions?
Thank you, Akhilesh. We have 14 minutes left. I think we can go over. I'm not sure everyone else wants to go over, but anyone have any other questions, just send them on in. I'll let Akhilesh go through the rest of the demo and we'll answer some more questions.
All right. So Matthew, like that's all I wanted to present today. We just to summarize, we went over through the risk management setup. We went over through the supplier's experience where we all saw different templates and questionnaires being presented to the supplier. And then lastly, we saw the risk dashboard where we evaluated risk scorecards for questionnaires, news-based scorecards, and also external agencies like DNB and so on and so forth. So using a combination of all of these tools, you get a 360-degree view for the supplier risk. And also it can be integrated with your supplier registration and onboarding process or update process. So you always have the updated risk score for your suppliers. So happy to answer any other questions that come up, or if there's any follow-ups, happy to answer it after this webinar.
Yeah, so there's a poll. If you guys want to click, if you're interested in any particular topic, we can follow up with you regarding it. I did have a question come in, and it was, can the questionnaires be in different languages?
Excellent question. So yes, it can be in any number of languages. Just to give you a preview, out of box, Apex has configured all of the supported languages that you're seeing on the screen on the top right corner. So questions can be presented in any one of these languages. So the supplier's experience can be in their language preference. If you don't see a language of your choice, our architecture allows us to add any number of additional language packs during the implementation. So thanks for asking that question.
So Akhilesh, I had a question, and we're talking about this at onboarding, and several of our clients have a discovery phase of suppliers want to work with them, and so they have them submit some info in a Apex portal, but not at onboarding or registration, but pre-onboarding. Can you talk about any questionnaires that you think could be valuable at that stage, or any clients putting the risk questionnaires at the discovery phase at this moment?
Yes, so if you are doing, let's say, an RFI or an RFP, or there are a list of potential suppliers that want to do business with you in future, so that's a great use case where you're capturing some preliminary information provided by the supplier, right? A name of business, where are you located, type of product services you're offering, and so on and so forth. So that's more of registration data. But on top of it, you do want to know whether the supplier is on an OFAC list or not, right? Before even deciding to do business with them, right? So prohibited list check is very important as the first step. The next step is, depending on the type of business, you do want to know what is the IT security scorecard of the supplier, whether they use child labor or not, or do they have these young workers policies and procedures in place. So most of the templates that I showed you can also be applicable in the discovery phase, because before you award a contract to the supplier, you do want to check on that risk and evaluate which suppliers is best for your company, right? So yes, a lot of our clients also manage risk long before registration, where they're still in the evaluation phase.
Thank you. Thank you. So you mentioned a little bit regarding diversity. I know that some of our clients use diversity validation at the discovery phase. We have a webinar, I believe it's in 2 weeks. It's going to talk about diversity in great detail, but we have been spending a lot of time in getting as many diversity data sources into Apex Portal and our other software. Akhilesh, could you just hit on some of the new data sources that clients can leverage to expand their diversity spend and supplier base?
Sure. So traditionally, Apex Portal and SmartVM have interfaced with the Small Business Association, which is sba.gov. It's a federal government authority. And we would be able to validate diversity or even append diversity information for your existing suppliers, right? So whether it's a women-owned business, veteran-owned business, based on ethnicity and many other diversity criteria. What we have also done now is extended the diversity data sources far beyond just the federal government data source. And now we are able to connect to the National Minority Development Council, NMDC, which also has a certification program for diversity in addition to just being self-attested, right? So we are able to connect to that data source, but in addition to that, we are also able to connect to a lot of state level diversity sources. So every state like California, North Carolina, etc., have their own diversity databases, right, which is not federal level, but state level. So we are connecting to those. We are connecting to the city level, county level, even municipality level in some cases, and adding to our diversity information, right? So now Apex has added close to 100 diversity data sources, and that's going up as we speak. So a lot more diversity information has been added, and we'll be talking about diversity in a separate upcoming session that Matthew, you were referring to.
So we got one more question, and this is good. I think we hit on some workflow approval workflows in the previous demo webinar, but here it is. How many teams are intended to use this tool? Just procurement and the supplier team, or can results be routed to other SMEs for review, like information security or insurance, based on vendor responses / risk?
Great question. So yes, it's just not those two teams, but a lot more departments or different approval processes can be added into the workflows, right? So to give an illustration, if I go into managing user security and look at the different type of roles, there is tax approval, there is legal approval, there is compliance approval, and many other types of approvals which can be added, right? So you have basically a role-based system where for any user you can assign different roles. And now, when you look at different teams, you have a data approver as well. So different type of approvers can be added, like even a contractor approval and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's no technical limit on the number of approvers or type of approvers you can add. Yes, we do have a out-of-box config for a lot of different use cases here that you're seeing, like region-based approval, compliance, legal, and so on and so forth, but a lot more can be added, right? So depending on the scope of implementation, we'll do some due diligence upfront and then add those roles into the system or use existing roles.
Thank you, Akhilesh. If anyone has any other questions, just throw them in the chat. But I just want to highlight next week, our session will be heavily focused on fraud. And these sessions are on demand within a day after it is live. So share them with any of your colleagues, or if you want to learn more, you can always reach out to us directly on our website and we'll answer any questions. I don't think any more questions are coming in today, Akhilesh. So one more down, 4 more to go. This is the Apex Portal demo series. Akhilesh, thank you for walking through everything today.
Thank you. And thanks for all the questions. Really appreciate the participation and see you next time.